Course 3, Lesson 11, and we'll look at Lesson 12. Both of them are very related. Lesson 11 is about percents, and Lesson 12 is about decimals. The goal of these lessons is to be able to effectively go between percents, decimals, and fractions, and be able to find the percent of a group. So, percents, decimals, and fractions, very, very related, and we can have one number being all three, shown in just the different forms. So, to go to a fraction, from a fraction to a decimal, I need to divide. So if I take my 1/4 and divide 1 divided by 4, I get 0.25. To go from a decimal to a percent, I need to multiply by 100. And you might remember it as moving that decimal to the right twice. So we get 25%. What if we start with a decimal though? Well, a decimal is really just showing, we can even give this a specific name like 75 hundredths, which we could show over here as a fraction, 75 over 100, which we can simplify down to 3/4. And we can once again take our decimal, multiply by 100 to get 75%. What if we start with a percent like 15%? Well, to go backwards to a decimal, instead of multiplying by 100 to get from a decimal to a percent, we're going to go backwards and divide by 100 and move the decimal back twice. And then we just have 15 hundredths, which is 3/20. 5/8 we just divide again, and we get 0.625. Multiply by 100, move that decimal twice, and get 62.5%. And lastly, we have 0.3%. We need to divide by 100 to go back to a decimal, which means that we get 0.003, which if we gave this a name, this would be 3 thousandths, and that's what we can say is our fraction, 3 over 1,000. So, with our fractions, decimals, and percents, we have a way to get from each of them. So if you remember, we have a triangle. Okay. We have our fractions, we have our decimals, and we have our percents. To go from a fraction to a decimal, we need to divide. So if we have 1/4 as a fraction, we would just do 1 divided by 4 and get 0.25. And that is our decimal form, 0.25. Well, to get from a decimal to a percent, I need to multiply by 100. Okay? So to do that, we would take our 0.25, move over the decimal twice, and get 25%. And to go from a percent to a fraction, well, percent is just how much we have out of 100. So we would have the percent out of 100. So in this case, we have 25 over 100, which simplifies to 1/4. Let's say you're given a decimal but want a fraction. Well, we can go around the around our triangle to go from decimal to percent to fraction. Or maybe we're given a fraction and need a percent. We'll go from fraction to decimal and then to percent. Okay? Let's practice some of these. So just remember, percents as our decimals, it's really just this fraction out of 100. Okay? We can say this fraction we can just divide. Right? Percents as decimals, if we have 0.52% and we need to divide by 100 to get back to our decimal, we would say this is 0.0052. 4% going to a decimal, we move it back twice and get 0.04. Back twice and get 0.184. Because going from a decimal to a percent, we multiply by 100. To go from a percent to a decimal, we can divide by 100. Okay, decimals as percents, remember we multiply by 100, so we get 27%. Okay. Okay? Whenever we're moving from decimals to percents, don't just move once, move twice. It's always moving twice. So that we get 3%, 1%, and 16.9%. Fractions as percents, we'll just do a couple of these. So 1/3, that's 0.3 repeating. But if I were to write it out, we could say it's 3, 3, 3, 3, and so on, right? So we can move that decimal twice and say that we get 33.3 repeating percent, or 33 1/3%. 3/8 as a decimal is 0.0375. And if we move that decimal twice, we get 37.5%. Notice that we have to go into decimal form first and then move the decimal, okay? You can try 5/6 on your own. Just think, it's going to have a repeating bar. Just a little hint, okay? So making fractions into percents, remember that denominator, okay? Our fractions can have a denominator, get it to 100. So if we have 3/4, well, we need to get this denominator to be 100. So we would multiply by 25 on each of these. So we would get 75 over 100, so 75%. The other way is using this idea of is over of equals percent over 100. A lot of times this comes up in word problems, so that's what I want to show you. Okay, 40% of the 30 students rode the bus. How many students rode the bus? So we have this is over of equals percent over 100. So do we see an is in here? We don't. We don't have that information yet, so we leave it as an X. We have an of because we have a total of 30 students, and we have a percent of 40. And my 100 always stays the same. Well, you can do a couple things here. You can simplify, all right? You can then cross multiply, and we get 120 equals 10x. So x is 12. There are many, many, many other ways to do this problem. This is just one that I want to show you that's a little new and very helpful. Here are some practice problems. If you need some other things to try these out. See how you do. Okay, use that triangle if you need to go between all of our different forms. And then we talk about decimal numbers. Okay, decimal numbers are part of being, one of our methods to go from fractions to percents. Okay, and we have our decimal places. So this decimal right here tells us a lot. If we go to the right and have numbers, we go from tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and millionths. If we go to the left, we have ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, and millions, separated by commas. So, can we write these decimal numbers? Well, what I'm asking here is, what are their names? And we can see we have 1 in the tens place, 2 in the ones place, a 0 in the tenths, and a 5 in the hundredths. So we would say this is 12 and 5 hundredths. Okay, this one right here, 3.4, this is really, its name is 3 and 4 tenths. And lastly, 9. Okay, this is 9 in the ones place, 2 in the tenths, 4 in the hundredths, 5 in the thousandths. So we have 9 and 245 thousandths. As you can tell, it's all based on that last number. This one's 5 hundredths, 4 tenths, 245 thousandths. Okay? And what if we have names but want to go to numbers? 45 hundredths. Well, we know we're after the decimal place because it has that th on the end. And we have 45 hundredths. 975 thousandths. Well, once again, we're after the decimal place, a small number, 975 thousandths, because that 5 lands in that thousandths place. So we're good to go. We need to compare some decimals. So if we have this idea, Mr. Nolan ran the 200-meter dash in 22.5 seconds, but Mrs. Mahan ran the 200-meter dash in 22.05 seconds. Whose time is faster? Well, the 22s are the same, so we need to look at the 5s. Okay, well, this one is in the tenths, so I have 22 and 5 tenths. Whereas this one is in the hundredths, we have 22 and 5 hundredths. Well, 5 tenths is much bigger than 5 hundredths, so we would say that Mr. Nolan's was slower because he had the greater time. Okay? You can also see it visually here with the tenths and the hundredths. All right, order from least to greatest. Okay, you can work on these. All right, and honestly, for decimals, it's really going back to being able to convert between our percentages and our decimals and fractions. Okay, so let's just do a couple of these. All right, so how about arranging these from least to greatest? Let's put them in one form. So 1/2, let's put them in decimals. 0.5. 12% is 0.12. 1.2 is already decimal, and so is negative 1.2. Well, my negative 1.2 is going to be the smallest. And then I have 0.12. I only have 12 hundredths rather than 0.5, which is 5 tenths, or 50 hundredths. And then we have 1.2. So we can see, put them all in one form, and then it's pretty easy to see what they look like. And lastly, last part of this is taking a percent of 75. There's many ways to do this. One way is, let's turn that 60% into a decimal of 0.6. Of in math means multiplication, so we could multiply those together. Another is using this formula up here that we talked about. Okay, we have the of 75, that's the total, but we don't know what is 60% of 75. So we put 60 as our percent out of 100. And we can cross multiply and solve the problem. Okay, so here are a couple other examples that you can try. Using decimals and multiplying, or using the is over us equals percent over 100. So try them out for yourself. I hope this was helpful for your studying and for homework.